quote Cicero, "Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears." My dear friends in Christ, I'm very happy to be with you again here in St. Louis for SEEK24. Last year was my first experience of SEEK, and it was electrifying. Last year, I spoke to you about being a spiritual entrepreneur. In fact, a lot of people have stopped me saying, "Bishop, we still remember your homily from last year." And I have to admit, it was one of my better ones. However, that's not to say that this year's talk won't be as magnificent. But in speaking about spiritual entrepreneurship, I wanted to capture the idea that if we were to truly evangelize the culture, we need to have an entrepreneurial spirit. And today I'd like to speak to you about Pope Francis and the characteristics of an evangelizing community. I was ordained as a bishop 20 months ago, and at my installation, I highlighted two priorities for my diocese: evangelization and vocations. I'm happy to report that this year alone in the Diocese of Columbus, we had 16 new seminarians begin their formation. And in 20 months, we have more than doubled the number of seminarians. In my first year as bishop, there were no priests ordained, and this year I will ordain 5. And vocations and evangelization go hand in hand because the priests can help animate the lay vocation, and we are all called by our vocation to be priest, prophet, and king, and to joyfully announce the gospel. 10 years ago, in his first year as Pope, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, wrote his exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. There he gave us the essential program of his pontificate, which involves being a missionary church. More than 15 years ago, he had been the ghostwriter of what is known as the Aparecida document. All the bishops of Central and South America gathered in a synod, and he was the ghostwriter of the final document called the Aparecida document. The bishops of Latin America realized then that the faith could no longer be transmitted by osmosis from one generation to the next. Almost the entire of Central and South America is or was Catholic. The culture is imbued with Catholicism, both indigenous cultures meeting the Spanish culture, but a very Catholic culture. And yet 15 years ago, the Latin American bishops were saying, wait a minute, our young people aren't practicing the way they used to. Family structures have changed. People are moving. We cannot just easily hand on the faith to the next generation as we previously could. So what are we going to do about it? And so the Latin American bishops came up with their strategy for evangelization, which the Holy Father, through the joy of the gospel, has now brought to the universal church. The bishops then realized that parishes and families were having difficulty handing on the faith. And even now, as a bishop, I hear more and more how parents are worried and grandparents are worried that their children don't practice the faith. I sent my child to Catholic schools, Catholic college, they don't practice. I'm worried my child is getting married but not getting married in the church. Or my child got married, but now they have a baby and the baby's not baptized. And then even people my age, when we were going through school, I have to admit, our catechesis was poor. The answer to every question in every religion class was God is love. Only that wasn't always the right answer to every single question. The bishops there acknowledged, what they acknowledged there has been brought to the whole church through the Pope's exhortation, the joy of the gospel, but also through other works, such as From Christendom to an Apostolic Age, published by the University of Mary, and their latest book from the University of Mary, The Religion of the Day. What is it that bishops of Latin America acknowledge and that even people here are acknowledging? The context in which we must evangelize has changed. It has changed fundamentally, and no longer do we speak of the new evangelization as evangelizing those people who were once raised Catholic but no longer practice, or evangelizing those previously Christian areas. Rather, our mission is ad gentes, to the nations, to people who never really have heard of Christ or have heard of him only in a very, very superficial way, but have never really met or encountered the person of Jesus Christ. For the Pope, the whole missionary endeavor begins with this encounter with Christ. Evangelii Gaudium begins with the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, Joy is born anew. But just as Pope Francis begins with the encounter with Christ, so too our late Pope Benedict XVI began his first encyclical letter with this idea of encounter. Very first paragraph of Deus Caritas Est, God is love. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person who gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. It is the encounter with Christ that opens up new horizons for us and gives our life that decisive direction. We gather here to meet Christ, the one who gives our life direction, the one who truly brings us joy, who fulfills our heart's desires. But we also come to encounter one another as brothers and sisters. We do not exist in a vacuum, nor do we evangelize in a vacuum. We do not exist in a vacuum adrift from relationships. Rather, we are inserted into a determined people and share a common lifestyle as Catholics. We are the one people of God who reveal the many faces of God. Pope Francis has a dream for his church, that it would be a missionary church. In Evangelii Gaudium, he writes, "I dream of a missionary option, that is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation." Now, as a bishop, my calendar is perpetually full. My secretary keeps telling me, you have to say no to some things, Bishop. You have to say no. But since I sleep very little, I say yes to everything, right? But at a certain point, you do have to be discerning. And the question I am beginning to ask myself is this meeting, is this appointment, is this trip, is it going to help me evangelize? Is it going to help me share the good news of the faith? Is it for others, or is it just for me? And if it's not for the purpose of evangelization now, I'm starting to say no to it. To understand what Pope Francis means by saying a missionary option, we should consider his words during his visit to Brazil now 10 years ago for World Youth Day. There he spoke of our continental mission, which is both programmatic and paradigmatic. The programmatic mission is a series of missionary activities, those things which we do from day to day, those things which we happen in our parishes, those types of activities. But the paradigmatic meaning is a little bit different. Here, he says, it involves setting in a missionary key all the day-to-day activities of the particular churches. Clearly, this entails a whole process of reforming ecclesial structures. The change of structures will not be the result of reviewing the organizational flowchart, which would lead to a static reorganization. Rather, it will result from the very dynamics of mission. What does our mission entail? It means making Christ known to every people and nation, going forth and making disciples of all the nations. Earlier today, I was talking with Archbishop Chuck Thompson of Indianapolis, and he was saying he had a parish in his diocese that had a twinning parish in France, and the church in France gave them this huge portrait of the church in France, and everyone was admiring it, and their parish council was gathered to see where could we put this in our church, and they couldn't find a suitable place. And then it dawned on them that if this image was so important to them, maybe they needed to restructure their church around this image, which they then began to do. Well, we need to restructure our efforts around the idea of the person of Jesus Christ and making him known. Everything we do must be seen in a missionary key. Pope Francis dreams of a new missionary spirit. Only from this paradigmatic choice to be a missionary church will authentic reform, vital for evangelization, flow. So we have some people from Cincinnati who are here, right? And those from the west side of Cincinnati know that everything, people, you ask them, where are you from? They say St. William, St. Lawrence, St. Teresa, 3 Catholic parishes all about a block from each other. But people identified with their parishes, right? And the whole west side of Cincinnati was very, very Catholic, except then the neighborhoods changed. And they weren't so Catholic, and the schools weren't so Catholic anymore, and the neighborhoods became largely non-Catholic. So the question was, well, do we just maintain these beautiful churches and schools, or do we go out and evangelize the neighborhoods, going door to door if need be? This is the mentality that we need to have, to be truly missionary and to be in the mode of mission rather than maintenance. This missionary spirit is vital for evangelization. Just as wind pushes against the sail and causes the boat to move against the water, so too the Spirit of God pushes the whole church to go forth into the world, attentive to the signs of the times and the needs of the people, jettisoning that which is obsolete. And Pope Francis adds, what makes obsolete structures pass away, what leads to a change of heart in Christians, is precisely missionary spirit. But this talk is really not just about having the missionary spirit, but characteristics of an evangelizing community. So if the Pope says we ought to be out there evangelizing, we ought to be out there as missionaries proclaiming the joy of the gospel, what would that actually look like? It is in this missionary spirit that the church goes forth. And in paragraph 24 of The Joy of the Gospel, the Pope writes these words. This is how that paragraph begins. The church which goes forth is a community of missionary disciples who take the first step, who are involved and supportive, who bear fruit and rejoice. In his address to the General Congregation of Cardinals before the 2013 conclave, then Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio said this: when the church does not go out of herself to evangelize, she becomes self-referential and then she gets sick. When the church is self-referential, without realizing it, she believes she has her own light. She ceases to be the mysterium lunae and gives rise to the grave evil of spiritual worldliness. Simplifying, there are two images of the church: either the evangelizing church that comes out of itself, or the worldly church that lives in itself, of itself, and for itself. This should illuminate the possible changes and reforms that will have to be made for the salvation of souls. This is our ultimate end, the salvation of souls. Thus, I want to highlight the characteristics now of an evangelizing church, which the Pope himself names there in Evangelii Gaudium number 24. Characteristics which we have, and which we could probably say we have in our community and in those gathered here for this week, but which could also be more prominent in our life and our missionary endeavors. First, we are a church that goes forth, which the Pope describes in this way. Instead of just being a church that welcomes and receives by keeping the doors open, let us try also to be a church that finds new roads, that is able to step outside itself and go to those who do not attend Mass, to those who have quit or are indifferent. The ones who quit sometimes do it for reasons, if properly understood and assessed, can lead to a return. But that takes audacity and courage. I was talking to Father Kevin Dyer. He's a Jesuit priest. He's a head of the chaplains, Focus Chaplains. And he was telling me that they've seen a 20% increase this year in peer-to-peer evangelization by Focus missionaries to fellow collegians. There are a lot of people who are hungering for Jesus, but it's those missionaries who are going out day to day to listen, to understand why people aren't coming, and inviting them to come to church. I've got a young couple in Columbus that's coming to see me to have their baby baptized. They've stopped going to church because they called their parish 4 times to see if they could have their child baptized. And the parish has its baptismal classes on a particular day and won't let them make up the class in any other way. Finally, I had dinner with the parents, and the parents were telling me about the predicament. I just said, send your daughter to me. I will do the formation and I will do the baptism in my chapel. And the couple has started to go back to Mass. Sometimes we put up barriers for people. When I was a young priest, stationed about 90 miles north of Cincinnati, on Tuesday nights we'd have the RCIA classes, and then afterward the RCIA team would go to BW3s, wings and beer. And then one day a woman came up and she had a layman Catholic high school t-shirt on, and it said soccer. And she said, Father, the man I've lived with the last 6 years, he really needs to go back to church. You need to talk to him. I said, well, send him over. But I noted she didn't say my husband. He came over and he said, Father, I'll be honest with you. I do need to talk to you, but I'm too drunk to talk to you right now. I said, well, write your number down here. I'll call you. Right? So he did. He wrote his number down. And I called him the next day. He didn't answer. I called him 2 days later, he didn't answer. I called him a week later, and I still had the thing on his phone number on my desk. Finally, his ex-wife called me and said, Father, our kids have been hearing your voicemail messages. They're very happy that you're calling. Keep calling. He really does need to go back to church. We divorced, but we got an annulment. So I called the man up, and he said, Father, you're the first priest in 8 years who's called me. You want to come to my house to have dinner? I said, sure, I'll come on over to your house to have dinner. And sure enough, the woman, her name was Sabrina, who had first approached me there in the bar. She was there. She had fixed dinner with their boys and said, Father, 8 years, no priest ever called me and never came to my house. I was an usher at Mass every week. I went through a divorce. I felt about this big. I couldn't keep my head up. Nobody from the parish called me. I moved back to live with my parents. They sent my envelopes to the wrong address for 8 years. Nobody reached out. And then all of a sudden he was back. He got married in the church and is living the life of faith. It's important for us not simply to maintain and take care of those who are already there, but to understand why people have stopped and to be bold in saying, yeah, I'll call you. I will go out. I will meet you where you're at, but I invite you to come and follow. To go forth to the spiritual and existential peripheries, as the Pope might say, demands courageously leaving our comfort zone and going and actually talking with people with whom we don't agree or who aren't living the life. Second, the community of missionary disciples takes the first step. It shows initiative. I've had a lot of people come up to me this week and say, Father, Bishop, we remember your homily last week, and even the priests, about a priest, if their salary was based on the number of converts they had, number of baptisms, number of communions, number of confessions, well, they'd be knocking on every single door to survive. Showing initiative. God seizes the initiative with us. Archbishop Aquila mentioned that this morning. God first loved us in Christ Jesus, and it's love that begets love. Pope Francis invites us to be imitators of God by having foresight. God seizes the initiative with us and calls us to do the same with those at the peripheries. He uses the Spanish term primerear, and that captures this idea. We need to be proactive rather than reactive. In this sense, we need to be spiritual entrepreneurs for Christ. The Holy Father writes, an evangelizing community knows that the Lord has taken the initiative. He has loved us first, and therefore we can move forward, boldly taking the initiative. Go out to others, seek those who have fallen away, stand at the crossroads, and welcome the outcast. I tell you, I feel more like a priest, more like a pastor, when I go into prisons and jails and meet the women and men who are there, incarcerated. They got a lot of time to think about what they have done. But there I see real faith, real conversion to Christ. And some of them simply want to know that I haven't been forgotten about. And it's the experience of the gaze of love that makes them change and want to get out and want to be better and want to be more for the Lord. Do we ever think about them? And are we willing to take the first step? Primerear captures this idea. The third characteristic of an evangelizing community that the Pope names is that an evangelizing community is involved or engaged with its members. The clear majority of the faithful are lay Catholics who have been made priest, prophet, and king through baptism. They have talents and they have expertise to offer to the church and the world. And certainly Focus is one of those organizations that wants lay people to use their talents and gifts. The bishops and the priests have the task of animating their vocations, including those of permanent deacons who serve beside priests and bishops in the Lord's vineyard, as well as married couples who can be protagonists for evangelization. In the family, married couples mentoring newly married couples, accompanying them through their times of difficulties. But do we truly engage those who are truly expert in our community in the work of the evangelization? Or do we just have the priests and deacons do everything? More and more priests will tell you it's difficult to get people to volunteer. We have to invite people personally. And sometimes people can only do one thing for the parish. My father was busy raising 5 kids. He was a physician, but he prepared couples for marriage, and he taught natural family planning. And the other thing he did was he gave physicals to all the kids in the school so they could be certified for sports. And that's all he could do. That's all his time, but it was something. Some people can only work the parish festival, and that's all they do. And they might not come to church very much, but it keeps them connected to the church. Do we help people to get going in their own vocation so as to evangelize others, and then we can strike up the conversation with them? When we say get involved with others, the Holy Father sometimes uses this word to be engaged with his members. He uses the word balconear. This is a kind of a term that's used in Argentina. It means, imagine a house with a balcony with two old ladies on the balcony. And they're looking out of the balcony, and they're minding everybody else's business, spying on them, and gossiping about who's doing what wrong, whose kids are bad kids, who's coming home late at night, how this person's lazy, how that person's husband's out of work. And all they're doing is gossiping and criticizing everybody and everything. They see everything. They know what's wrong. They identify the problems and do not lift a single finger to make the situation better. Now, we can imagine those old ladies, but now let's imagine our faces. Because we do this exactly with our church and our parishes. We point out what the bishop's doing wrong, what our pastor's doing wrong, how these other people aren't coming to church, what's wrong with the school principal and all the teachers, how the coaches are always wrong about everything. So what are you going to do about it? Right? And social media only gets us more jazzed up and riled up. We get in the blogosphere and we get negative and about everything that the Pope's doing wrong, all the problems that are wrong with the church. And who wants to be a part of the solution? Who says, wait a minute, I have an idea how this could be better. And here are my ideas about how to implement that idea. And I'm going to go talk to my priest about this. Or I'm going to go talk to these other people who can actually do something. But we don't. And we succumb to the cycle of negativity rather than get involved in the lives of parishioners. The Holy Father sees this type of person as the opposite of someone who is an evangelist. He proposes Jesus as the opposite of the person who simply stands on the balcony. He says, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. The Lord gets involved, and he involves his own as he kneels to wash their feet. He tells his disciples, you will be blessed if you do this. An evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances. It is willing to abase itself if necessary, and it embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ in others. Go to a nursing home and visit an elderly person who's all alone, whose kids never visit them and never write to them. Write them a letter. Write to prisoners and those who are incarcerated and to their families. Migrants who are far from their home and are living in camps and in really subhuman conditions. Do we actually get involved and go see what their life is like and try to make their life a little bit better, even with the simplicity of a smile? Sometimes I would try to train little children to sing, especially at Christmas time, to bring children into a nursing home, to sing about Jesus and his birth. What good it does for the elderly and the sick. What comfort it brings. And those little children are heralds of the gospel with their beautiful little voices. And the elderly people see hope for the future. The Holy Father wants an evangelizing community to be a community that is engaged in the life of its members, to offer constructive proposals. One key to evangelization, then, is to reflect upon what it is, besides negativity, that the Church of Christ has to offer to the world. Or rather, who is it that the church offers to the world? Is it someone who's always negative, always complaining about everything? Or is it the Redeemer, the Savior? A fourth characteristic of an evangelizing community is that it accompanies others. Speaking in Assisi, the Pope says, I repeat it often, walking with our people, sometimes in front, sometimes in the middle, and sometimes behind. In front in order to guide the community, in the middle in order to encourage and support, and at the back in order to keep it united, and so that no one lags too far behind, to keep them united. Accompaniment, which the Pope uses all the time, entails guiding, encouraging, and supporting, and uniting. We journey with our people even if the future is not always certain. And as we accompany others, we also learn the art of dialogue. Jesus says to go the extra mile. We live in a time of epochal change. We who announce the gospel cannot evangelize by neglecting the new forces at work, affecting new generations who have their own expectations and aspirations, including those who are now coming to this country. I mean, we have 1 out of every 7 people now in the Diocese of Columbus speaks Spanish. We have new migrants from Africa and India coming, and everything is changing. I spoke earlier of the suffering of many people, especially the elderly and the poor. But many others are frightened simply of change and frightened of strangers. Rather than seeing a brother or sister as a member of the family, they see them as a threat or as a competitor. What will this new person mean for me, for my future, and my existence? I remember, even though we were from India during the Carter Ford years, we were in a very poor neighborhood, and a lot of my friends, their parents were out of work. The American automobile industry was getting beaten badly by Honda and Toyota. And finally, some of our classmates said, why don't you go back to your own country? Even though India is very far from Japan, has nothing to do with Japan. Why don't you go back to your own country? Because they were afraid, they were threatened. But in the face of this existential fear, one approach would be simply to build a wall around ourselves. But this would never banish their fear. The scriptures say perfect love casts out all fear. It would not help them to live in a new way or experience the joy that comes with the freedom offered by Christ and his gospel. The alternative to building walls is dialogue. And at the heart of dialogue is the communication of one's own personal life to others. It is a sharing of the existence of others in one's own existence. Sharing the joy that we know of being loved by Jesus Christ. Not saying faith is something private just for me, but being willing to share it with those who do not yet know Jesus. There are many people with whom we disagree, and it's true, we live in a polarized society. But dialoguing with a person isn't always about proving oneself right. It is about a mutual sharing that deals with how to live in harmony while offering the best of our tradition. I am hopeful that our gathering this week will allow us to share something of ourselves with one another, even if we don't necessarily know someone particularly well yet. Despite our theological, personal, and even political differences, I think that through dialogue we begin to learn that we share far more in common as Catholics and as humans. A fifth characteristic of an evangelizing community is that it's fruitful. In paragraph 24, the Holy Father refers to the parable of the weeds and the wheat, writing, "An evangelizing community is always concerned with fruit, because the Lord wants her to be fruitful. It cares for the grain and does not grow impatient with the weeds. The sower, when he sees weeds sprouting amongst the grain, does not grumble or overreact. He or she finds a way to let the word take flesh in a particular situation and bear fruits of new life, however imperfect or incomplete these may appear. And fruitfulness demands discernment and patience. When the Pope speaks of discernment, he's speaking about apprehending a reality, reading that reality in light of faith, and then deliberating the pros and cons and making a choice in light of the faith and in light of the goods involved. The fundamental task, though, is discernment. And the parable of the weeds and wheat speaks of distinguishing what is from the Son of Man, who sows the good seed, the children of God, and what is from the devil, which is the bad seed, the weeds, the children of the evil one sown by the devil. In Greek, the word used for weeds is zizania, which specifically refers to ryegrass. Zizania looks like wheat as it begins to grow, but only when it is mature can one discern the difference. Jesus cautions his disciples of the need to be patient and to discern, because things are not always initially clear. While farmers discern between weeds and wheat, the church embraces people who have the possibility of responding to the divine initiative and who by grace can be transformed from sinner to saint, from weeds to wheat. Again, I go back to the prisons and jails. Last Christmas, I went to Chillicothe, Ohio, south of Columbus. And I went into the men's prison, and there's actually a Catholic chapel in the men's prison. Maybe we need to do a better job of forming our Catholics in virtue. A whole prison just for Catholics. And then after I had Christmas Mass there, they brought me into the gym, and I had Mass for all the Catholics on death row. some of whom converted to Catholicism while they were incarcerated. We could just say they are wheat. We should just get rid of them. But they were given the grace of this moment to repent and to turn their lives over to the Lord, and they're living a new life. Last Christmas, I thought, I wonder if this will be their last Christmas. God be praised, it was not. But the Lord is patient. One saint, when asked, what is patience? He says, patience is that which one is willing to suffer out of love for another. We want people to somehow be up here and to live the faith and be living the life. But sometimes it takes some time, and that demands patience and a lack of judgmentalness on our part. Following Jesus' example, we try to be patient. And patience is that art of accompaniment and discernment which allows the whole church to move forward. Pope Francis sees patience as a mark of holiness. I see holiness in the patience of the people of God. I often associate sanctity with patience, not only as hypomone, taking charge of events and circumstances of life, but also as constancy in going forward day by day. This is the sanctity of the militant church, also mentioned by St. Ignatius. The final characteristic of an evangelizing community is joy. It celebrates even small victories in the work of evangelization. Joy is the greatest experience of the church that goes forth. And the Eucharist is the source and summit of all life in the church, and is the sacrament which nourishes Christian joy. It is the strongest sacramental sign of the paschal lordship of Christ, recalling his victory over sin and death. In the Eucharist, Christ is among us. The joy that he has won is preserved and shared. Eucharistic joy is not incomplete joy or fading like the pleasures of this world. It is a lasting joy. And joy is the fruit of the Holy Spirit, whom the risen Lord, breathed on the apostles at Easter. The apostles rejoiced to see the risen Lord. The church celebrates the Eucharist with spousal joy of one promised to Christ. Every bishop wears a ring, and it's a sign of being espoused to his local church. And that brings me great joy to know that I have a bride. But we are loved by Christ, the bridegroom. Archbishop Aquila again touched on this morning, to know that we are loved. People say, Bishop, Father, why are you always smiling so much at Mass? And it's because he's here, and he gazes upon me with love, and I can see him. He is truly present, and he loves me in spite of all my faults and failures. When I was a small child, there was a little girl on the playground who came up to me and said, Earl, you're a gorilla. Your hair is black like a gorilla. Your skin is black like a gorilla. Your nose is smashed like a gorilla. Your lips are big like a gorilla. You must be a gorilla. And I took it as something racial. So I did the only thing that a 6-year-old little boy would do. I chased her. I chased her all over the playground, here, there, everywhere. And I was right about to catch her and throttle her. And instead, I ran past her, up the handicap ramp, into the church. And there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And my brothers and I, we always rattle off our Fathers and Hail Marys very quickly. But I stopped and said one Hail Mary very slowly. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And as soon as I said those words, I felt a feeling of warmth and peace come over me. And I knew that I was loved by Jesus and his mother Mary. But when First Communion Day came around, I always I had a question in my mind. Lord, do you love me as the same as the rich kids, because we were very poor? Do you love me as the same as the white kids? Do you love me as the same as the kids who were good at sports, because I was hopelessly uncoordinated? And on my first Holy Communion Day, I found out the answer to that question. Yes, I love you. And I have never forgotten that day or that moment or that joy. And that is why I became a priest, so that I could hand on that joy to others. The Holy Father writes, evangelization with joy becomes beauty in the liturgy. The church evangelizes and is herself evangelized through the beauty of the liturgy, which is both a celebration of the task of evangelization and the source of her renewed self-giving. I think we need to examine whether our local churches, our campus ministries, our parishes, our family lives demonstrate this joy, which flows from the Eucharist. The Eucharistic revival years that we are experiencing afford us an opportunity for the church in the United States to experience and celebrate the nuptial joy of a community that is loved by the Lord, a clear mark of a community that evangelizes and is herself evangelized. And so the Holy Father calls all of us, the whole church, to go forth boldly to the spiritual and existential peripheries, but go forth with joy. May God bless you all. Thank you.